Hi, this is Paul, and I have a special guest today named James Frazee. And James goes to, well, James, introduce yourself.
My name is James Frazee, and I'm a professor of psychology at Cosumnes River College here in South Sacramento. So Paul and I serve a similar demographic of folks in very different ways and in some very similar ways.
Okay, I met you before, but then we bumped into each other and we discovered a similar interest in Jordan Peterson. Why don't you talk a little bit about how you found Jordan Peterson and what got you interested in him?
Well, Paul and I met in a completely random way. That he came to the church I attend, and I just saw him that morning and greeted him and got to know him and found out he was a pastor down here at Livingstone. And I thought that was really neat that on his day off, he would go to church. That was a pretty profound thing for me. On my day off, I wouldn't go lecture. Actually, my wife probably thinks I lecture at home. But, so I met him then, and randomly, I saw some videos that he was doing with the Freddie and Paul show back. I told him today that I saw the Aslan rap video, and I thought, oh, I just got to keep watching this. It hooked me from the beginning. And synergistically, both he and I became interested in Jordan Peterson and the videos that he was releasing. And so we got to talking, and then I became a part of the meetup group that he started here. And it's just been a really insightful time to hear from people and to be able to talk through some of these things. And it's been a real intense and good and learning experience to be a part of the meetup group. I just find it so fascinating. So many interesting people come and they share some really great ideas I haven't thought of and say things I don't agree with. And I like that type of thing. So it's been fun.
Okay, so you first heard about Jordan Peterson from a student, correct?
Yeah, so I teach at the college here, and I teach, I should have said that before. My PhD is in clinical neuropsychology, so Dr. Peterson and I have similar training. And one of my students came to me and said, oh, a lot of what you're talking about sounds a lot like Jordan Peterson. And in fact, the way you speak does, because you say things forthrightly that are somewhat shocking and meant to make us think about things in a deep and intense way. And he said, you sound a lot like Jordan Peterson. Have you watched his videos? And so I hadn't, and this was office hours. So I said, do you want to watch some? And I think we picked up on one of his videos on the personality lectures. And so I watched that with the student and heard some of the similar things that I teach my students about people and their behavior, the brain. And it was also some things, I also teach statistics at the college here. And so I really enjoyed the way he described empirical methods of investigation. So that really sparked my interest. And then I kept watching and my professional development sort of took a Jordan Peterson turn.
Okay. And so your professional development took a Jordan Peterson turn. What does that mean? How has he shaped you, do you think?
One of the most important things in my job is being able to communicate very complex ideas about the brain and behavior relationship, which fundamentally people understand the idea of that. But when it gets to the nitty-gritty, it's very difficult to give good analogies and to speak clearly and concisely. And I teach at a community college, which has an intense difference in people's abilities, preparation. And so what I love about Jordan Peterson is that he doesn't compromise the language, but then he recognizes sometimes that people aren't familiar with things and explains it in a way that helps people to understand very complex ideas about neuropsychology. And so that really helped me to think through how it is that I'm discussing difficult concepts about the brain and how that translates to literally what people are doing, how they're feeling. And it's been really helpful for me to use some of the language to be able to communicate effectively with my students.
Okay. So what part of Jordan Peterson's, I mean, the guy talks about all kinds of things. What part of the kinds of things he talks about are of most interest to you?
That's a loaded question, right?
They're all loaded.
from, from a professional standpoint, I enjoy his integration of the mysterious elements of what we don't know and how science doesn't explain a lot of things about the integration of biology or brain neuroscience and people's experience of their conscious mind. That's a great thing to think through. But from a personal standpoint, another thing is that when I was doing my training, the curriculum was you don't just focus on neuropsychology. You also have to pick something completely different from what you're doing. And so you were given these options of what you could go into. And I could have done school psychology. I could have done rational emotive behavioral therapy. I could have learned some sort of other technique, but I sought out one of the instructors, Dr. Teague. Actually, I think he's now here in Sacramento, and he's the Jungian, and he taught us a curriculum of Jungian psychoanalytic, psychodynamic psychotherapies, dream analysis. We did intense experiences where we would go for a week to a Franciscan monastery out in the middle of nowhere in California and do silent retreats where he would lecture to us during the day, but we were to do nothing about speaking at all. And that was really powerful for me from a personal standpoint. And so I began to read a lot of Jung's work and Freud and Adler. And the curriculum that we used for one of those, or one of the parts of that, was a book that Peterson describes as a fantastic intro to psychoanalytic and psychodynamic thought. And that's the Discovery of the Unconscious by Ellen Berger. I highly recommend that book. It's thick tome, but it's good stories. And it's not just the theories of these people who are having really interesting thoughts about human spirit, psyche, intellect, pathology, psychosis. It's really a great read. So I highly recommend that one. So the personal side was that Jungian and psychoanalytic thought really helped develop me as a person. Not something that I apply, and I don't actually teach that in my real life job at the college, because it's not something that's part of our curriculum, and it's something that people would get if they're continuing a course of study in psychology and really focusing on clinical aspects of that.
Okay. Now, as a pastor, I went to Christian school, K through 12. I went to Calvin College. I went to Calvin Seminary. I'm very much a product of my subculture. And I would have to say that if there was someone that I almost never heard anything about in all of my educational years, it was Jung. And Jung has a very negative reputation in the evangelical community. A lot of people are made nervous by him. They have concerns about the occult. They have, the evangelical community has had a long-standing suspicion of Freud and Jung. But now, as you mentioned, we met in church. So you go to church. You're a Christian, and you studied Jung. And how should Christians think about Jung, in your opinion?
I don't know. My personal experience, again, the side of Peterson that we're talking about that professionally I understand is very much the neuropsych side. Mm-hmm. And Jung is much more of someone who helped me to understand myself in relationship to my community, in relationship to a larger community, in relationship to the inner part of who I am. And it really was a benefit to me personally. What should Christians view? Well, my experience is like yours. I actually grew up going to what you call an evangelical church. You actually taught me what that was. I didn't know. We just called ourselves non-denominational. And I thought that meant that all we did was not pay a larger organization. I didn't know that there was such a wide doctrinal difference. But again, that's the context you grow up in becomes your reality. And I went to a Christian school my whole life. My mother actually taught. She was a teacher at the Christian school. I used to joke, I was at my church 7 days a week growing up because I went to school there Monday through Friday. Saturday we had sports, and Sunday we went to church.
Wow.
So it was, I was immersed in Christian evangelical culture as a college student going to the University of California at Irvine, I was completely blindsided by the secular worldview. I hadn't been introduced to it. I hadn't been provided with the necessary basis to understand what was happening, and it became a big challenge for me to integrate who I was and to create a system of beliefs for myself that were authentic rather than ones that I had been given from that context. So when I was in graduate school studying, and I went to church in college, I went to a little church called Saddleback. Right.
They weren't non-denominational. They're Southern Baptist, but they don't talk.
Oh, is it? Okay. I didn't hear any of that. There certainly were no dances.
Well, a lot of people won't know Saddleback is Rick Warren's church. It's a mega church in Southern California, very important church in terms of the seeker movement. So go on.
I will say this, like I watched the Freddie and Paul show from the beginning. I actually went to Saddleback when it just met at El Toro High School. So there was, it was not what it is now. I did that because my aunt and uncle lived in El Toro. It's now called Lake Forest. It was called El Toro back then. Nonetheless, I went away from the church, and I didn't have a church I belonged to. And I didn't go away from my beliefs. I didn't go away from Christianity. That as I studied things, Christianity remained a foundation for me at what Jung might call the shadowy level, the low level, that was the reality, but I had avoided really wrestling with it and dealing with it. And it's something that is difficult to do when you are living in the context that I was, going to graduate school studying neuroscience. There wasn't a lot of room for spirituality in that. And it's one of those things that is such a blind spot for science, is the integration of religious and spiritual aspects of people. And so I knew personally that was something that was real to me, that was always an important thing to me, but it wasn't something that was supported by my academic pursuits. So how should Christians view Jung? First of all, I would ask, how should Christians view Darwin? That's one of those things that a lot of people have these ideological presuppositions about them that they've been told about them. Have you read On Origin of the Species? Have you read Aeon, or have you read the Dream Seminar that Jung talks about? Have you read Answer to Job? If you're a Christian, go read Answer to Job by C.J. Jung, and it'll really challenge you. So I found his work to be completely okay with my belief system, because I didn't expect him to be the answer. I didn't expect him to be the new religion I was seeking. I expected, and I got from Jung, a broadened perspective on my own beliefs.
Okay. So you grew up 7 days a week going to church.
I did.
And so you had, I mean, I think there are a lot of people who say grew up in a non-denominational evangelical church, going to Christian school, and then go to secular university. A lot of it's almost a trope that people who then they go to secular university, then they give up the faith, but because it's Darwin or Jesus, and many churches, I don't know if that was taught to you growing up.
That wasn't taught explicitly, but there was definitely an implicit training. And I think that's the part that was really important to me was, you can't believe this. This isn't real. This isn't something that you can consider. And when I was challenged to read books at the secular level in my academic training, I guess maybe I'm high in openness.
That's becoming apparent quite quickly.
And maybe I'm high in openness, but I didn't read them as though they were going to supplant what I believed. I read them as a perspective that gains, my life's too short to think through these huge existential philosophical things. That's why tradition is so important for us, is that we can learn from others and we can know what to expect, and that we can have an enriched life, not trying to figure it all out on our own. And I was really open to reading those things. And when I read through Darwin's On Origin of Species, I was blown away because he talks about the glorious design that God had in nature. Nobody talks about that when they're teaching evolutionary biology. But the foundational text is from a preacher's son.
Yeah.
And he had that context. And if, Carl Gustav Jung was also a preacher's son.
Yeah.
And they had that context the lens through which they saw the world, and they expounded on it, and they developed their belief systems that were separate. But I think a lot of Christians sometimes will arbitrarily write off somebody who's a thinker if they've said something that's not in line with doctrine. And that dogma keeps you from being exposed to more things. And it doesn't mean that your belief system has to change, but it does mean that you should probably be exposing yourself to things that make you think critically. And that's something that I try to teach in my students on the academic side, is that they question what it is that they believe, and that there's difference between knowing something and believing something, and both are completely okay.
And so it sounds like instead of, having, this either or, because of your openness, you integrated and you figured out.
I am integrating.
You are integrating.
Yeah.
So here's a question for you. So Peterson is closer to my age than your age. And so I can very much identify with his experience in the Cold War. My upbringing was very different from his. He grew up at least a little bit in a mainline church, United Church of Canada, then left the faith, and then now is in this weird place of acting as if there is a God, acting as if Jesus saves us, acting as if the resurrection happened, all of this stuff. What do you think Peterson is up to? What does Jordan Peterson want to accomplish?
I've been very curious about that, because having watched his videos, you try to find the theme, or what is he getting at? What I want from Jordan Peterson, I don't think is necessarily accurately what he's looking for. I want more intellectual thought and critical thinking and new ideas about how the brain works to promote consciousness, and what's that integration, almost going back to a Cartesian analysis, but with the advancements in neuroimaging and neuroscience that we have now. I want him to do that, and that's not what he's doing. And what he is doing is important. And you and I had the experience of having gone to Jordan Peterson's talk here in Sacramento. And I went, and I said this in the meetup, that I went, I actually brought my wife, and we sat in the front row. It was really an amazing experience. And we went, and I had said this to her, is that this is my breakup with Jordan Peterson. I think I have Jordan Petersonitis. I'm ready to, I've heard what he said. I'm ready to move on, and not have him be somebody that I'm listening to and who's influencing the way I think. And when I saw him give his talk, and I heard him speak in an extemporaneous fashion, and his thinking through talking I really relate to, I was so appreciative of that. But that wasn't what changed the way I thought about him and what he is doing. What changes that in the VIP experience, the OMG VIP, whatever acronym it is, we got to see him interact individually. You and I did. You had a much better seat. I was the last, almost the last person in line, and you were one of the first ones by happen circumstance. But you got to sit there and listen to him and hear what he said to these individuals, and hear how they interacted with him. And I didn't get to hear the words, which I really would have liked to, but we're all where we're supposed to be. And I got to see him and see his body language and see him interact with hundreds and hundreds of people after he'd lectured for 2 hours, done another hour of taking questions that are really difficult. And I know how draining that can be as somebody who speaks in front of people for a living. You know how that can be, speaking in front of people for a living, and then individually afterwards being present for them. I was so struck and impressed by his ability to connect with somebody in a incredibly short period of time. And as my training's in clinical neuropsychology, which has nothing to do with meeting people in therapy. And we can talk about that later, but I do know about therapy, and that usually has a lot of time. That's one of the beauties of it, is that there's a lot of time there, and he was able to make genuine connections with people, and he was present to talk to them. And it was just a tour de force of what his mission is. And that's individually to connect with people and to help them improve their lives. It's really a testament to what he says he wants to do. And that I saw that actually happening. So I think he's really being, at least as far as he can be, sort of like his book says, at least not lying about what he's doing. I think he really is attempting that. And I see that by him extending his tour and continuing to do that. Now, we have talked in the meetup about what his longevity is going to be like in this. And I know from my experiences as a lecturer that you can run out of fuel. And unless there's a break, like I'm on break right now and I'm loving this, but unless you rejuvenate, and I don't know how he does, but unless you continue to maintain a consistent level, that's something that I worry about. Is he going to be able to continue to do this? Because it's a yeoman's task.
Yeah. I'm blown away by his endurance, and I had exactly the same. That was the biggest takeaway of the evening for me, was watching him connect with individuals, because I know what that requires of a person, and that blew me away.
We even heard from people in our meetup who said they were sitting in the very back of the auditorium, and they felt that he was as present with them as I felt sitting in the front row, seeing him eye to eye. They felt that too. And that's a testament to somebody who's really given themselves to being present for people.
Yeah. Now, have you watched many of his biblical series?
Oh, that's my favorite stuff.
Okay. Why? What do you think of his biblical series?
Oh, I've talked with you before. I have some big problems with what he says about the Bible.
Such as?
A lot of things. I don't want to dwell on those negative parts, because I think what the benefit is thinking about how he's engaging people to consider these scriptures that are so profound in changing humanity, in changing individuals and communities and countries and the world, more transformative way than has ever happened. He appreciates that and is giving it credit. And to me, that's something I don't want to put the negative, my personal subjective negative aspects of what I think he's saying. I don't think he's saying, well, I'm not even sure I have a position to say, but I don't think he's saying heretical things that can't be beneficial for instruction of people who have given their belief systems 100% faith to Christianity and who abide by the tenets of the church. I don't think it's bad for people. I think it's something, again, where there's a profound group of people who have unmet needs and that would be served if they, and you know this as a pastor, seeing people who are so spiritually need driven, and he's providing a gateway to them to really consider what these stories, myths, realities mean for their life. And I find that to be just a tremendous boon to a lot of people. I actually use a lot of biblical language when I explain analogies, because that's the culture I grew up in. Those are the stories I read and I studied and I was preached to about, and I considered and how I thought about the world. So actually in my teaching, sometimes biblical stories come up. And that's really something that also is true in Western culture. Our storytelling has been shifted by biblical narratives. And so his focus on it and his unabashed connection to the Bible is really a breath of fresh air from an academician. I always feel like I'm going to be singled out as some sort of a wacko who's teaching neuroscience and then uses an analogy from Cain and Abel to talk about children and development and birth order. And yet here he does talking and biblical lectures that are sold out, and people really do want to hear about it. And sometimes I don't know whether or not that's his charisma or the way he speaks, or whether or not that's the stories. I think it's probably synergistically both. It's the right time, the right place, the right stories, and the right person doing the speaking.
Okay. Do you find that your students at at the college that you teach at, when you use biblical references, do many of them understand that these come from the Bible or know anything about the Bible?
Well, I have to read the room and see if they're nodding, if they're paying attention, and most of the time they are. Some are unfamiliar with the stories, but that'll just take a little bit of explanation. And that's one of those things where, I also teach, I didn't say, but I teach human sexuality. And so a lot of what we talk about when we talk about traditional cultures and cross-cultural sexuality, and we discuss where our sexual mores come from, biblical stories are some of the best references from historical anthropological investigation as to how did people engage one another from the standpoint of courtship, marrying. We discuss that, and a lot of people find that the Bible to be a helpful source for them to understand the historical perspectives on how people have engaged one another.
So this guy who grew up as an evangelical who went to Saddleback Church is teaching human sexuality at a public college in Sacramento, and they're letting you do this.
I could say the same thing about this guy who's sitting here doing Jordan Peterson lectures.
Oh, maybe we're traitors to the cause. One of the questions I get often that I feel particularly ill-equipped to address, that I really wanted to have you on this to help me with. Now, I grew up in the Christian Reformed Church, which is its own insular bubble. I don't drink alcohol, not because of faith reasons, because Dutch CRC people drink like they know how to drink. I don't smoke tobacco, even again, Dutch CRC people, they don't have any religious qualms about tobacco. And I've even cut out a lot of caffeine from my life. But I regularly have people coming to me and asking me about psychedelics, because this has been a big element of the conversation. Not only Jordan Peterson talks about them a bit, but if you listen to Joe Rogan, Michael Pollan, who's famous for the Omnivore's Dilemma, is now written a very big book on psychedelics. There's a huge openness in society, and I know nothing about this. And you've got a PhD in neuropsychology, and you've talked about this at the meetup a little bit. I just wanted to get your take. I don't know how much of this conversation you've heard, but people look to me for wisdom on this, and I don't have much to offer. So what's your take on this?
So I have personally never taken any psychedelics, and that's the traditional kind. So from the perspective I'm speaking about, if we're going to discuss it, it's not on an experiential side. It's on the side of understanding what's going on in the brain and how brain chemistry affects how people feel. That's the least interesting aspect of psychedelics whatsoever.
Really?
Of course, because the brain science that we're talking about here is, are we affecting different neurotransmitter systems? And when I say those things, oftentimes my students will just shut off.
Their eyes glaze over.
Their eyes glaze over.
We have no frame of reference for any of that language.
And do we? So what I like to do is to try and bring it back to things that we do know about, things that we understand. And given the epidemic of depression in our culture, and the American Medical Association and American Psychiatric Association and American Psychological Association's stance on this, the prime treatment for depression is to take a pill that alters your serotonin, what are called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors.
Right.
Now, this is acting on the same system that something like psilocybin or ayahuasca are going to be changing in your brain. All right. So the basics of it is, you have a brain. The brain is consistent of a lot of cells called neurons, but even more called glia. But the ones we always focus on are neurons, and those communicate to each other. You have some other cells that kind of do communication, like in your endocrine system. That's why psychoneuroendocrinology is now a huge, huge field of study. But neurons are really special. They're different. They're unique in that they last your lifetime. When you're born, you have all the neurons you'll ever have. Well,
really?
You don't. You grow some, but it's almost inconsequential because they're only in areas of our brain for developing new memories and smelling new things. And from the day you're born, you'll have less neurons. But the ones that stay become really important because of something that they do, and that's that they interact with each other. They talk to each other. And how they talk to each other is inside they do chemical and electrical communication, but between each other, they can only communicate chemically. Now, this is where, when we're taking a drug that's going to alter that, you have to understand what's the essence by which it could change the communication. If you sent a letter to somebody overseas and I intercepted it midway and wrote something different on it, what would the effect be of that? If you said, hey, come visit us at Christmas, and I said, don't come visit us at Christmas, the reaction would be different from the next cell. And simplistically put, the cells can give each other, this is extremely simplified, and I do that just because, A, my understanding of it is simple, even though I've been studying it for a long time and I think about it a lot. It's difficult to do this because I'm actually doing it with my own neocortex. The cell can tell the next cell, hey, get excited or get less excited. So that's sort of what we have, is this big classification of drugs, which would be central nervous system depressants. And those would be things that like alcohol. That's something that acts on the GABA. And again, GABA, I could even use the bigger word, gamma aminobutyric acid. Who cares about that? What it does is it's the primary neurotransmitter that tells your brain, calm down, send less signals. And you have all these neurons for your whole life since you were born that have been communicating to each other. Now, if you alter them with something like, say, alcohol, then it's going to turn on a system specifically in the frontal lobes, which are the areas of your brain that help you focus attention, help you move, are part of your personality. And also the most important thing, and you know this from alcohol, is that they inhibit you from doing things that you wouldn't normally do. And so when we're drinking alcohol, you don't, I do, is that you're inhibiting your inhibiting system. So you're becoming disinhibited. And that would be a central nervous system depressant. An excitatory central nervous system response comes from other drugs that work on different systems, like, say, cocaine works on the dopamine system. And so that tells the cells, get excited, send more neural activity across your channel, which is called the synapse, to the next cell. So what also happens is that when we're taking hallucinogens, or those are psychedelic drugs, those are drugs that are aimed at altering the normal flow of information to our brain. So we've got our senses out here, and all of our senses are limited. In fact, one of the poets, William Blake, I think Blake, said, if the doors of perception were cleansed, we would see the world as it is, infinite. And I use that in my teaching because not the sort of, hey, go, on a Timothy Leary trip with LSD and do something fun, but it's to understand how your senses actually perceive the world. And that's that there's a limited range by which they see the world. And this is very easy for people to access because, your dog can smell things that you can't smell. And you find that because they get into it and eat it and roll in it. And then you smell it. But our brain has limitations. And that limitation, there's a small part of our brain that's not the big neocortex side where we spend all of our time thinking, but it's called the thalamus. And other than smell, it acts as a valve system for sensory input. And so sensory input goes through the thalamus, and this is a grouping of cells that then sort of limit what the rest of the brain gets. And as it does so, it keeps us in a boundary or in a range of sensory perception. When somebody goes and takes ecstasy, also known as Molly, or MDMA, or methyl deoxymethamphetamine if you're a psychopharmacologist. What it does is it uses the serotonin system, that's a neurotransmitter, and it sort of takes the brakes off, and it allows for sensory perception to go out to the neocortex with less involvement of the filter of the thalamus. And what that does is that people feel, a lot of times they express feelings of euphoria or sensory perception enhancement, if that's what they call it. And so that's people who are doing that are altering their brain in a way to make it like you could hijack your car. If your car had sort of a governor on it and you took the governor off, you could push the engine faster. And so that's kind of what it is like to hijack your thalamus with the use of something like MDMA, or with the use of psilocybin, those magic mushrooms, ayahuasca, DMT. So again, I could talk about this for a long time, but what's interesting to your listeners, and what have people told you that they want to know about psychedelics and how it affects people?
Well, so you've got Sam Harris over here that says, oh, he doesn't want to be labeled too much of a materialist. He says, oh, I'm really into consciousness. And, so I take these psychedelics and I have these wild experiences of consciousness, but those are just stuck in my brain. So you got Sam Harris over here trying to be cool with the other kids and not just be a square naturalist. And then you have more of the spiritualist, new age, experimental community that says, when I take ayahuasca or psilocybin or, one of these drugs, I get in tune with a much bigger reality than my limited senses can take. So I've got these two sides coming at me, and I listen to them and I think, you two are playing with the same drugs, but thinking whole lots of different things about it. So
I couldn't agree more. It sounds so much more like questions, the hallucinogens, the psychedelics aren't even the issue here. It seems like they're almost a tool for those people to explore their thoughts that they're already having. And a lot of people will say, oh no, it awakens me to new thoughts. I have a problem with that. And I don't think that it's necessarily awakening them to thoughts that they couldn't have. But I could talk out of both sides of my mouth, because there has been shown in the use of psychedelics in clinical applications that some people have reported being able to become more empathetic when they, because of whatever experiences they had, their brain sort of tracked a way of behaving, that this enabled them to incorporate a new style of emotional regulation that would enable them to sort of become more empathetic if they've, say, been shut off emotionally from some trauma in their past. I don't know. I know that when we think about our perception, we think that it is in a totality, that we're actually perceiving the world as it is. And it really isn't. Jordan Peterson's famous for talking about lobsters and their hierarchies, but lobsters can see ultraviolet. They can see ultraviolet. You can't. Yeah. You can't see ultraviolet things. We know ultraviolet things exist. We know that there's a wavelength of photons that's in an ultraviolet spectrum. We can't visually perceive it. Our eyes don't have the bandwidth to perceive that. But we use it all the time for babies who have a particular buildup in their system with bilirubin. Their liver can't function to break it down yet. You shine some light on them, and in that full spectrum of light, there's ultraviolet light. It does the work. Yeah. Now, what's funny is that when they first invented these machines to use ultraviolet lights to help babies who had an excess of bilirubin, they would turn the light on, and again, it's an ultraviolet wavelength, so you can't see it. And parents, you're a parent yourself, I'm a parent. And what happens is this baby who's maybe colicky or frustrated and not feeling good is still squirming around, and they turn the light on it, and the parents expect something, and they don't perceive anything. And so they got really mad at the manufacturers, the doctors. So what do the doctors do? Some medical engineer decides, okay, well, why don't we just put in a black light in it? You can perceive the violet portion of the visible spectrum of light. Right. It's not going to do anything to help the bilirubin. It's not going to break down the bilirubin, but then people will think that it is. And now there are no complaints when you put a baby under this light, except for that they have to wear these little goggles now. So what people think they perceive is not the totality of what is. And coming to grips with that is an existential crisis. Is the answer to that to trick your brain chemically into doing something that it doesn't do? I would argue that if you don't have the context to do that in, that you're really grasping for straws, that you should try those things that your brain naturally does. You should try everything else first. You should try things that are going to give you ecclesiastical experiences that we know, breathing practices, imagery, religiosity. You should try reading, intellectualizing. You should try all these other things to engage what your mind can do and perceive in a healthy and in a stable way, because you haven't exhausted those answers. You really haven't. You haven't done the work that it is to sort of find who you are in this world, where's your place, and what does that mean for you, and how how you should go about doing things. And the other question I have for people that are talking about this, like say the Sam Harris side, which is he's denying the spiritual element of people and saying that it's all happening here. I'll say to him that part of my training was in neuropsychology, was at the hospitals, and what I was involved with was called intraoperative speech mapping. And in an intraoperative speech mapping, the patient lays on the side, their cranium is opened by the neurosurgeon, actually the residents, no, the neurosurgeon never does the opening, but because the patient's under, then the anesthesiologist wakes them back up, and I come in and I do some cognitive testing with them as the neurosurgeon is sort of searching for what does this tissue do, because we want to avoid taking out tissue that's important for that person to function if we're taking out the bad stuff. It's a great idea. I had existential crisis when I would be talking to somebody like I'm speaking to you, except for your face might be draped with some sort of a field to keep it away from the surgical field. And on the other side of that curtain, I can see your gray matter. I can see the folds of your gyri, and I can see him touching it with an electrode and then suspending your ability to sort of name a picture or remember something. And there's an element of, is that all that we are? And Sam Harris would say, yep, we're just complex robots. And what you can really find out what the complexity is of this robot if you take this, magic mushroom. And I would really venture to guess that what he's actually physically experiencing in that moment is a connection to something that didn't take me magic mushrooms, but took me looking at someone's neocortex and then looking into their eyes, the window to their soul, and seeing that person, seeing that what you describe, and not you, I'm sure. You're the pastor of the intellectual dark web, but I don't think you invented the idea of the imago Dei.
No, I certainly did not.
But that's your language that you use to talk about that personhood, that holiness, that worthy, that dignity, the thing that we do see and we support in our society. And we've even codified it in our language of our Constitution, that people are made in that image. And that's not all that we are, as these complex neural circuitry that I've been describing, how we can alter the sort of petri dish up there. That's not the limit to what we are. When people take psychedelics, a lot of times people take psychedelics and they experience bad trips. And I think Jung would say that what they're engaging is the part of their subconscious that's the shadowy side, or the side that we want to avoid, right? That's part of us, but that we don't want to incorporate into thinking about who we are. Jordan Peterson talks about, that you have the capability, that you wouldn't have been the person in Europe to save the Jewish people from the horrible Nazi prison camps, but you would have been that person who turned a blind eye. And he uses the language of the Gulag Archipelago to talk about that's what most people did. They were all informing on each other. And that's part of you. And so when people experience bad trips, that's part of them. A lot of the literature on it will say, oh, you got to take it in the right context. Well, I'm not sure what the right context is. And if you're going to experiment with psychedelics, I would suggest that you experiment with things that can take you transformatively to a place that you haven't been before, that you would do things that are going to push you to physical limits, to intellectual limits, to emotional limits, that would also create for you a sense of newness and creativity and insight before you go messing with drugs. And the reason I say that is one of my trips, I was, not one of my trips, that's a Freudian slip. You could call them that, but one of my internships, I was at the Children's Hospital Oakland, and one of the patients I saw was a young girl who took a whole bunch of ecstasy. We didn't call it Molly back then, we called it ecstasy. And she took way too much. And it literally, there was one time, she took it one time, she took way too much. But the effect that it had is that it overrid a system in her brain. And when neurons get too excited, if in fact, when you get hypoxic or you don't have enough oxygen, they don't slow down. They actually speed up into like you redline your engine until it breaks. And that's what happened in her brain with some of the serotonergic system, is that it burned little tiny holes, little infarcts, little lacunar holes in her brain. And this poor young 17-year-old girl, with her life in front of her, with everything out there, was now apathetic, such that she didn't have any real ability to control herself. If you said, go bang your head against the wall, she wouldn't think not to. She was now sort of not an efficacious agent in this world. And I saw that negativity. And, you know, and also I learned about reading some of the bad LSD trips that people had. I think it's laceric acid. There's LSD, LSA, there's a whole bunch of them. But some of the bad acid trips that people took had some pretty severe consequences to them, including when they took too much, they could have really profound paralysis. And we learned about that when we were studying the brain and dopaminergic and serotonergic systems.
That's really helpful. What's interesting to me too is that, so, you know, we're getting a picture of you in this little video, and so we have James.
This is the face. This is the hidden behind the face of who I really am, right? Right. So we've got. If I took some DMT, you'd see the real me.
Well, so we've got James, who grew up in church. James, who still goes to church as an adult. James,
not who still goes to church. Remember, who then decided as an adult to go back.
Oh, okay, who went back to church. Now we're talking about, okay, the brain and its function, and you're talking about this formative experience that you had of doing this job of looking into the gray matter and looking at the face, because obviously when we look at the gray matter, we don't see the person.
Exactly.
You can line up gray matters and say, oh, they were born in Detroit and their mother was withholding and their father was generous, and and they went to school here. You can't see any of that stuff looking at the brain, but they're probing the brain. One of my kids at home is now newly into House. He didn't watch it back, it was on TV, and he's kind of going through House, and they sometimes do these brain probe things, and people will taste something or they'll smell something, so on and so forth. So when I was a missionary, I was one of the women in one of the communities I worked with came to me one day and said, "Oh, missionary, I had a dream about you last night." Haitians were very big into their dreams. And I said, "Yeah, what did you dream?" She said, you were surrounded by flowers and fruit." And I said, "Well, what does that mean?" It's dream interpretation, which of course Jung is very big on. And she said, "Well, this means you're going to have a lot of children." And this was interesting to me because my wife and I had one child, and we didn't think we were all that fertile, and so we were sloppy in terms of birth control. And I kind of laughed at her, kind of Sarah's laugh. And now I went on to have 5 children, which is a lot in North America. And biblical dreams in the Bible are very important. Joseph has these dreams that are prophetic, and Daniel has these dreams that are prophetic. So knowing, what you've said about experiences and psychedelics and you having studied Jung, I mean, how do you piece this stuff together? Is the Bible just hooey on that, and we just record the dreams that come true, and is it a selection bias, or does God actually work this way? What do you think?
Well, nothing I say in statistics or in biological psychology or in human sexuality gets people so mad as to when I talk to them about the difference between sort of the biological aspect of dreaming and the sort of more metaphysical, spiritual side that we tend to think. We tend to think they have meaning. We tend to maybe record those ones that have meaning to us. And the one that I had about mopping the floor when there's all those squirrels around, I don't have any interpretation for that. So it doesn't necessarily sort of integrate into who I am. A lot of people have the experience of dreaming and then look for meaning to it. But from the perspective that I teach, and this makes people very upset, is that you don't actually dream when you're asleep. Okay, now
that sounds funny.
Right, and I like to say those things because that gets people to think, and that gets people to consider what you're saying. So if we have these 2 states, right, one would be consciousness, the other would be unconscious. Well, which one are you when you're asleep?
Unconscious.
Exactly. So tell me other things that happen to you while you're unconscious.
I don't know, because I'm not conscious.
Right. So then why do you think that you would perceive dreams that happen when you're unconscious?
Oh, that's interesting, especially when we consider death the big sleep. So,
So here's a problem, is that we do have this experience of dreaming. Not everybody, I think everybody, but we remember them or experience them in different ways.
Right.
But you're actually dreaming when you're awake. You're actually dreaming. What you have the experience of dreaming is is awakeness, and remembering this sort of imagery. You're having this imagery, or this woman was having imagery of you, and not you, but her projection of you is what Jung would say. And all these flowers, these sort of symbolic flowers around. Now, if I had an EEG, that's an electroencephalogram, I have all these electrodes that are recording her brain's neural circuitry, and I had some way of going back and putting those electrodes on your brain and reversing the they only record, they don't send anything in. But if I had the ability to sort of send in that neural circuitry to you, would you dream the same thing? Absolutely not.
So we have two different brains.
You're two different brains. But your neural circuitry is doing a whole bunch of activity when you're asleep, when you're unconscious. So from the biological side, you don't have access to the conscious perception of what that neural circuitry would be like when you're awake. There's all sorts of people who have problems when they're sleeping, people that, there's a man who murdered his wife. There's people who have driven cars, people who have, cooked when they're asleep, boiled water. There's all sorts of anecdotal evidence of what people have done. They don't remember that at all. That's not a conscious perception.
So are you saying so my grandfather was a big sleepwalker. Are you saying, so when he was
somnambulism?
So one of the big stories we had in my family was my grandfather used to grab my grandmother's arm and pull her arm in the middle of the night. And he was having a dream that he was rescuing her for something. My grandmother had very little tolerance for this. And finally one day woke him up and said, if you ever do this again, I am divorcing you. And he never did it again. But
she spoke to his subconscious.
Yeah. So you saying he's conscious or unconscious when he's dreaming and then acting on it? Because that kind of confuses my definitions of conscious and unconscious.
No, you're unconscious when you're asleep. We can watch that. We can watch your sleep neural architecture. So your neurons, they have what's called a spontaneous firing rate, and they fire at a certain rate, just randomly. When you go to sleep, they slow down. And that's the general sort of simplistic way of saying it. And we can watch the sleep architecture, and it takes a certain pattern where they'll get slower, 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 and then they'll kind of speed up, and then they get really fast, almost like awake, but not really awake. That's called REM, or rapid eye movement.
Okay.
What's going on in the brain is that your lower part of your brain during that fast acting time, it's not fast acting like we're having right now, which is awake and conscious sort of activity, but it's really fast compared to the other levels of sleep. But at that time, your brain sends a signal to the rest of your body to relax, to relax. So if you ever see somebody in rapid eye movement, the only thing that you see moving is their eye. And the reason is that the signal comes from below their third cranial nerve, or their ocular motor nerve. And so their eyes move all around and do crazy stuff. But that's the only part of them that's moving while their brain's having this very fast activity. They're completely unaware of what's going on. However, if you wake them up when you see their brain doing that REM sleep,
right,
they are more likely to report a dream than if you wake them up in this almost like suspended animation of what's called slow wave sleep. They are very less likely. They'll wake up and they're really tired. They're really not refreshed. They really have a hard time sort of getting up to a conscious level, because you're way down at the bottom of a neural activity and you got to speed it all up. Right. If you're up at this higher level, this REM, you're probably closer to your awake conscious level activity. And so people report dreaming more. Now, this gets people very upset when I tell them that they only dream when they're awake, because you're not dreaming when you're asleep. You're only having the experience of that dream as sort of interpreting what was going on in your brain with neural circuitry in that active pattern before. Some of the interesting neuroscience on that is that when you teach a rat a new maze, they do T mazes where the rat has to go up and go left or right. That's a T maze in neuroscience. And they'll record what's happening or how that rat is learning that maze in neural circuitry. And then at night when they watch it sleep, it rehearses those patterns when it gets into REM. That those patterns start to reemerge. And this is something we know from studying people, is that if you deprive them of REM sleep, they will not be able to retain information that they newly learned that day. That's why I always tell my students, you got to get a good night's sleep the night before an exam, rather than stay up and waste your time cramming for something that you won't be able to remember.
Right. So, okay. So you're saying, well, we only dream when we're conscious. And I can kind of understand that. I'm not upset by this, but what is that? Can God talk to us through our dreams?
Well, I remember being told that the message was another interpretation of the word dream, right? Or angel, or some sort of a message from God. And so people for all time have thought that dreams were telling them something, that dreams are an important element of who you are and how your life should be guided. And I think a lot of the psychedelics in the ritualistic ceremonies that I've understood is that they're used in a context to promote insight. They're used in a context to give the person a new identity, to give them something that they haven't experienced before. And I think that that's probably been done in culturally over a long period of time, where people have understood what to expect and that the culture promotes what to expect. I think our culture doesn't have that relationship with psychedelics. Here in America, we have a relationship since they became illegal in the 60s, and Timothy Leary lost his job to the Summer of Love and all that sort of experimentation with culture, with relationships, with men and women, with society and government, and with our experimentation with who we were by taking psychedelic drugs. A lot of those things stuck. A lot of those changes stuck from the time of the 60s to change till now, but a lot of it didn't. And one of the things that didn't stick was the use of psychedelic medications or drugs as a part of a ritualistic way. Now, I would argue on one hand that we do need to think about the development of our youth. And I see this all the time with my younger students. The typical college student is an 18 to 24-year-old, is that they're going through some really profound changes in who they are as a person, and that we don't really have standardized ways in which we can help them know what to expect. And we don't really have a good developmental cultural ritual by which they could know that they're now gaining a responsibility of an adult, gaining the rights, and we don't have that. What we do have is a continual process of foreclosure, where we're giving younger and younger people more and more adult level responsibility before they're ready. And this is akin to what Jung said about beware of unearned wisdom, right? Because what are you going to do with it? How are you going to bring that back from the hero's journey into your culture and reincorporate it into a way that's helpful to everybody? How are you going to complete that cycle if you're having these big personal experiences that are not relatable to your culture? You need to know your culture. And so I would, if students ask me, should I take psychedelic medications? I would say probably not. You probably shouldn't. But maybe. And I don't know everybody's particular situation. I do know this, that variation is the one true thing we can count on, and that people are different. So maybe, but probably not. And as a statistician, as somebody who tells people to look at the probability outcomes before they decide a decision, before they make something that's potentially dangerous for you, be very careful about it. Not that it's always bad, not that it's somehow like this, CIA and MK Ultra, you're going to have mind control, or, the chemtrails are controlling us. But that just be careful what you're ready for, and have you developed yourself? And is this something that is necessary? Or is this something that you're just trying to experience that's different? And I would really question people as to why they would like to take or ingest these substances that are going to alter their neurochemistry in sometimes permanent ways.
Well, it's interesting to me when you frame it that way. I think of the fact that perhaps our cultural attitude towards psychedelics exactly reflects our culture, because we are looking at psychedelics as, in a sense, Sam Harris of, well, we are going to use our mind like a playground.
Yeah.
Whereas in traditional cultures, they are saying, we're going to respect this area of life as in some ways sacred. Now, I'm using sacred here as a functional term, that this is something that we as a society protect, give reverence for, behave in a way that says this is special and set apart. So whereas we as a society say, acid, let me try it, I'm bored. So
we have sort of done that as a society. Here in California, when we legalized marijuana, although you can't do that if you don't understand Hamilton and Jefferson and our country. Anyway, when we legalized it, what we're saying is we think it's okay for people to experiment with this drug. We think it's okay, and we're not going to criminalize it, which I do agree with. I don't think we should criminalize the use of drugs, but we should educate. And marijuana is a mild hallucinogen. And so when people are hallucinating on marijuana, what they're doing is they're altering their neurochemistry. You actually have endogenous cannabinergic receptors, so they're part of your brain that respond to cannabinoids. You have them in your brain. You release them when you do big runs or when you have an orgasm. And when you smoke marijuana, you have an active molecule you're ingesting that's then going to alter that system. Whether or not that's a wise thing for people to do, we do know this. For young and developing brains, it's a very bad idea to smoke marijuana. It is. For young and developing brains, you shouldn't be experimenting with marijuana.
That message does not get out.
It doesn't, but the scientific literature states it very clearly. In fact, there's now growing evidence that experimentation with marijuana might actually precipitate psychotic breaks or people getting schizophrenia.
Wow.
That's a thought disorder. And what's going on is that we have these propensities, these genetic propensities towards something, but that unless it's enacted upon with some sort of contextual element, it won't come to fruition. And what they're now finding is that the use of marijuana is now thought to be something that can trip that can catalyze the change from somebody who wouldn't become schizophrenic to them actually experiencing schizophrenic symptoms. So that's one of those things we know they shouldn't do. In fact, we know, and this is something I do want to talk about more, which is that these illegal drugs are used far less than the legal drugs. The legal drugs that are prescribed. And the legal drugs that are prescribed work on the same brain systems. The legal drugs that are prescribed to us have the same potential for bad things to happen to us. They're regulated and they're sold by pharmaceutical companies. So now there's this market interest, and it changes the way we interact with them. And our medical legal system, especially the suing your doctor for malpractice side, has come up with some really bad behaviors that we have now in prescription practices in treating mental illness. We know that teenagers should not be prescribed selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, the traditional antidepressants. We know that for a fact because what it does is, for a small subset of them, it makes them more suicidal. Like it's called iatrogenic or doctor-induced. That the cause of it, they would be less suicidal if they hadn't taken the drug the doctor gave them. And that's the opposite of what we're trying to do. So this discussion, this conversation of how we alter our brain chemistry is a very, very long one and a very big one.
It's not one that I hear. I mean, now with the increasing, if Michael Pollan, if his book continues to get attention as it has been, we might have more of that conversation. But part of my pet peeves is that I think as a culture, I think we have not done well at having broad cultural conversations in a productive way. And this is what I think is hopeful about the intellectual dark web or using YouTube or the capacity to have long form conversations. And I think Peterson is right that via podcasts and YouTube, more and more people are going to find these conversations accessible and productive. And then ideally, again, we model the kinds of behaviors necessary in order to have productive conversations and not soundbite yelling and politicking the kinds of things that we're seeing, especially in our political realm right now.
Yeah. Strangely, I got to meet Michael Pollan.
Really?
He wrote the book Omnivore's Dilemma.
Yeah.
And our college chose that as a one book. I used to be a part of the one book committee at our school and provide group where we're all as a college reading a book together.
Yeah.
And Omnivore's Dilemma was the one we chose because it went cross curriculum, that a lot of people could apply that to what they were teaching in their college courses. And we invited him, and he actually came and talked at our college. It was really neat to meet him. If you read Botany of Desire, he talks about growing marijuana and actually taking opiates. He's somebody who grew up in the culture where that was a lot more appropriate, a lot more sort of mainstream, is to experiment with those. And I really don't see that expanding to a broader community in in the youth that I see.
Mm-hmm.
I do see a lot of people using marijuana. I do not see a lot of people experimenting with, say, DMT and psilocybin, and that's a small subgroup of people. And so I think there's always been a small subgroup of people who have wanted to do that. And that's probably always going to be around with us. Maybe it's those group that are really, really high in openness. Yeah. But his book on psychedelics, I haven't read it yet, and the summer's almost over. So I would say I'm putting it on my reading list, but hey, if you're listening, Michael, please do the audio version so I can,
I think he is. I think there is
hear what you had to say about it.
Okay. Well, do you have anything? I've pretty much driven this conversation so far. Do you have anything on your list that you want to talk to me about, or get me to say on camera?
I'm not going to hijack this with my own personal stuff. We can have conversations at meetups. I will say this. What I see you doing is respectable and it's honorable, and I appreciate it. And I know a lot of people that listen to you are really encouraged and inspired by what you're doing. And I know I am. I told you I ended up starting to watch more of you than I did of other people. And I think your prodigious output is pretty intense. So get help with it sometimes. Have people like me come on and talk to you so that you're not the one who's having to think out loud the whole time.
Well, I mean, people often comment about that, but I am, and we talked about a little this before in my office, I do just think out loud. And for me, it is helpful. I have these thoughts, and if I take the extra step of either writing them or recording them, of taking just the additional movement of trying to get it down, I find that helps develop the thoughts. And then I record them so I can myself go back and find them and think about them. And, for me, this whole experience has simply been an extended learning process. And the fact that others are benefiting from it, to me, is icing on the cake. I would probably do this for 5 subscribers, and I would be totally happy with that. In fact, the volume of email that I have coming my way is increasing, and I'm gratified by this. And that actually feeds this. The frustration I have is, you say I'm prodigious. I can't keep up with everyone throwing things back at me because I got to process and integrate. But to me, the meetup aspect of it has been just a joy. I was just sharing with a pastor friend yesterday. Even though we have women that come to it, this has been the most successful men's ministry I've ever done, just because most of those who show up at the meetup are men. But this, to me, has been just, I look forward to every time we do it, and I always leave gratified and refreshed from it.
I play basketball every Sunday night. It's a ritual that I have a group of guys I play basketball with, and I really enjoy basketball. And when I don't get to go because of family obligations or I have to get up early or something, I really miss it. And I'm finding that I'm experiencing that with the meetup too. I will be missing my first one this Sunday because I'm headed up to a family reunion. So tell all the people at the meetup that I greeted them, and that I appreciate them being there and the community that we've created. That's even going beyond sort of Jordan Peterson stuff.
Yeah. No, that's true. So, well, thank you again. And I really appreciate you taking the time. I'm glad we could do this. And, I really appreciate the conversation about the brain and drugs, because this is an area that people come to me with questions, and it's like, I don't know, I'm a pastor.
Well, next time we'll talk about transubstantiation and being elected.
That sounds like fun. And there's a lot of folks out there that really want to be sitting in the chair you're at and being thrown questions at me on that. So
maybe I pulled too many punches.
All right. I really appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.